Welcome to Lesson 5 Watercolour Techniques. The materials you will need are paints, any sort of paints, cheap paper, watercolour paper, any sort of brush, a towel, paper towel, 2 jars of water, one for painting with and one for washing your brushes, and a water spray if you have one. So I'm just showing you some of my materials here. So I have the 2 jars of water, the water spray. I have a variety of brushes, but use whatever you have to hand. So I have some large, round, small round, large flat, small flat. And just to show you that more clearly there in front of the paper. I'm using student grade watercolour paints and I have a palette, so some sort of palette, even a plate and a pencil. I've drawn out 5 circles. This particular technique is to do with the amount of water to paint. So the analogy that we're using here is to do with milk. So I've written tea under the first circle, then coffee, followed by milk, followed by cream, and then butter. So we're going from weak to thick. So if we think in terms of the consistency of milk in tea being maybe the weakest, typically don't put too much milk in tea, then a bit more in coffee, then actual milk, then thicker milk, which is cream, and the thickest milk, which is butter. So that's likened to the amount of paint. So how thin your paint is and how thick your paint is. So we start off with a thin wash. So a lot of water and a little bit of paint. And then again, into that mixture, add more paint. So you're constantly adding to what you already have. So you're adding more pigment to create what we call a sort of coffee wash. So it'll be darker than the tea, or you could say more saturated in colour. So that's a richer colour. Milk is thicker again, so we've added a bit more paint to the mixture. And then again, cream, thicker. So cream would be typically, it's very rich and it would be the thickest sort of paint that you would normally use for watercolour. And then the butter, as you'll see, is just straight from the tube, which can be used sparingly. And if you were to try it out as a brush stroke, it's a really sort of dry brush stroke. So you could do these purely as brush strokes instead of circles, or use squares, whatever. This light to dark also refers to how you would build up your watercolour painting. Ordinarily, you start with a wash and you slowly build up your colours. So it's from light to dark, subtle to vivid, and or thin to thick. So I'm just writing some notes there, which, sorry, they're not, that one isn't particularly visible there. So I've written wet to dry and light to saturated colour. So there I just had a dot of watercolour on my paper and I'm trying to clean it off. So I used a wet, clean brush and a cloth. So they're the brush strokes you see, they're very dry. So they can be useful, but I would suggest sparingly useful to use pure pigment. So I'm going to draw 2 other small circles. And with these, what I just want to show you briefly is how to create that spherical look. So the look of a sphere, or a gradiated look within a circle where it's lighter on top and darker at the bottom. So you get the gist of it. It doesn't exactly transpire very well because it will drip at some stage when I turn the paper on its side. So I shouldn't have done that, but you get the gist of what I was doing here and there. And then we're going to move on to washes after this, and I show you a graded or gradated wash. And essentially that's all I'm showing you, but inside a circle. And most of you have done that exercise before, so you know what to do in that sense. So this next part, this is just a flat wash. So I'm using upwards and up and down brush strokes. You could use from side to side, slowly bringing down the colour. And really what you're looking for here is a flat tone, a monotone. And when you say wash, it just means a large surface area. So this might be how you would start off a painting. The next one I'll show you is pretty useful for sky. So it's a graded or gradated wash, and I'm beginning with maybe a slightly darker colour to begin with, or tone to begin with, almost like a milk tone, whereas the last wash was a coffee tone. So you start with the pigment at the top, and thereafter you don't use pigment, you use clean water to drag down that paint. And as you drag it down, within each sort of step of dragging it down, the colour gets lighter. So you're fading it out. So you're going from saturated, slowly, gradually down to almost desaturated. But it gives a lovely effect for the sky, because oftentimes the sky is bluer further up and it's more faded below because of the atmosphere. Next part, we're just going to look at wet on wet painting. So that's a term you might have heard before. So there's wet on dry, wet on wet. And to start with wet on wet, we put down just a wash of water. So I'm using a flat brush, kind of a large flat brush. I won't bother giving you the numbers or anything like that, the number of the brushes, because it's just a tester, and I don't want you to get het up if you don't have the brush that I have, whatever you have will be fine. So there we have the water on the paper, and now you're putting paint down. Now I use quite thick paint, and you see I'm just spotting it there and just seeing what effect it has, and it's sort of bleeding outwards, which is I love that effect with watercolour. Sort of blooming, and as you put in more colours it becomes even more interesting, and the colours mix, so you can be mixing colour straight onto the paper. So of course you can mix colour in your palette, and you can mix colour on the paper, and by doing this sort of effect. So I've put red down, and you can see a lot of purple elements. So I'm just trying to, as you see there, back into the circles above, trying to make that more spherical again. It just dried out, and it's that paper, although it's good paper, is starting to bubble. So the paint wasn't sitting where I wanted it to sit. And now I'll make a big boo-boo with this part, because though I'm focusing on letting the paint bleed at the bottom, of course the paint that I've just put down on the spheres bleed as well. But as I said, I think you all know what to do with that, and I may revise that again next week, just before I start the portrait painting. So it's just to show you the effects that you can achieve with watercolour. Gravity can be your friend in watercolour. It can be quite nice to paint at an angle, or whether it's on an easel, or just you have it angled between your lap and the table. You can get pretty interesting effects. Of course, if it's raining or something, that effect that gravity can have could be really useful. The next part I'm going to concentrate on is painting wet on dry. So I'm going to let this square of red paint dry. And now that bit of paint is dry, so I'm going to paint blue on top. And this is to show you another way that you can sort of mix colour, but you're dealing with transparency, so it's not so much that the colours are majorly interacting with each other. They're not mixing in the way that they were with the wet on wet. With the wet on dry, it's partly due to the transparency that you're getting this third colour. So you're getting purple. Now, of course, once you introduce wet onto dry, that will wet up that pigment below a little bit as well. But largely what you're looking at is a layered interaction between the two colours, as if you were to layer a piece of blue plastic and a piece of red plastic in front of each other. It's that similar effect. So the benefit, I guess, of painting wet on dry is that you achieve more control. So that's called transparencies. I'm just writing that down there. So I would say more control and a sort of flatter texture. Whereas the wet on wet is sort of, there's a lack of control going on, which can be really lovely as well. So it's to test all these things out so that you sort of become a little bit more literate in watercolour painting, and you know what effect you want to use or try out. But I think that exercise with the tones is particularly important. So that's obviously just flat tone that we were dealing with above from the tea to butter chart. But and then again, I think the gradient wash is really useful for particularly for painting skies, and I think a lot of you have used that. So I just wanted to try out another couple of colours with transparencies. So I'm putting blue over yellow. And then I'm going to put yellow over blue. And you can just see maybe the difference of layering a darker colour over a lighter colour and a lighter colour over a darker colour. So when I put the yellow over the blue, it's a lot darker. Of course, I probably put, the blue that I put down was probably more highly pigmented, but it still sort of has a bit of trouble penetrating the darker colour. So you're almost, in one way, more free if you put the lower colour, the lighter colour below the darker colour. Now, I just got a couple of smaller pieces of watercolour paper just to experiment. So I would recommend that you have a bit of fun with watercolour and experiment. Here I'm really painting a lot of wet on wet, and I introduce lots of colours into this one and sort of let them all bleed, and then use gravity at the end to let them bleed even further into each other. So I'm just using what this palette calls a primary blue. I think that's the primary red as well, but I don't think they're exactly primary colours. Bringing in a bit of sort of light sap green. These are obviously just little abstract pieces, so there's no pressure, it's just about play and experimentation. And there's a cadmium yellow. I'm going to bring in more water again now, just to mix those up a little bit more and let them bleed and sort of run free. With that one with the one on the left now, I have sprayed water on top of it, so it's slightly giving it a bit of a texture. But if you even wait for that to dry a little bit more and spray again, it'll create even more of a texture. And now I'm putting on quite a milky, in terms of consistency, milky wash onto the second piece of paper, just trying to experiment in a different way. And now I want to use paint splatters. And I also just sprayed water on it there. So again, just trying out texture. If you were to do like a night sky or a Milky Way and get all those colours down, and then if you were to splatter white paint, it could look quite effective for stars. I don't have white paint at the moment, so I'm just using what I have. So it's just testing, messing about. So then using gravity again, just to play around with that one. And that was the outcome. And the outcome of the second one. So they're just like a little, like something you'd have in your notebook. So this paper is 300 GSM. You have 300 GSM, I think, and that's a great quality in terms of weight. It's good weight for paper. And this is cold pressed. You have cold pressed paper also. I've drawn a little boy on this one. And this is ready for next week's portrait painting. And that's my preparatory sketch. It's on watercolour paper as well, so that might be quite useful for me to test out before I put anything on the larger finished piece. And just to emphasise again the importance of preparatory drawings. This is a better quality paper. Again, it's cold pressed, it's fine grained. So the other one was fine grained as well. A fine grain is really good, I think. It's cotton, it's 300 GSM as well. It's a very good watercolour paper. And I've done another drawing on this. So I might end up doing two, but I kind of felt like I wanted to have a couple of choices. So I had done a preparatory sketch of this, I think it was 2 weeks ago. And I had that on a time lapse. That was the 40-minute sketch, which was part 2 of the lesson I did on children's face proportions. So here it is. You remember that preparatory drawing? And it took a lot more time to draw this, and it's mostly a line drawing. There's a little bit of shading in there, so a little bit of shading is okay.